Pursuit of Dorothie. In Pursuit of Dorothie. In the mid-1800s, prior to the Civil War, children were playing, as children do, in Gates County, North Carolina. They played in the open fields, around the barns, anywhere they could adventure within earshot of home. In this particular scenario, the children lived on a farm built up against the western edge of the Dismal Swamp. The Great Dismal Swamp was a haven for the shingle cutters, runaway slaves, bears, and snakes. The cutters would make their way into the swamp as best they could to cut the juniper trees to make the shingles. Many times they would cut a path from the swamp's edge to a particular stand of trees. This day, in the mid-1800s, the children followed the cutters' new path into the swamp's edge until they entered another cleared area, this time cleared by nature, not the shingle cutters. There they found to their delight the hulk of a two-masted sailing ship, known in those days as a schooner. The children removed metal objects from the rotting wood of the ship, and I'm sure played about the hulk for many days until their interest turned elsewhere. No one knows how long the ship was the centerpiece of the children's play, but the story lingered in the memory of one of the children. This particular child grew into a woman, married, and several children were born of the union. Near the end of the 1800s, one particular offspring, a young man, questioned his mother about the ship as to its location. He'd heard the story many times. Following his mother's childhood memories, he made his way into the swamp's edge and observed the still further decaying remains of the schooner. He relayed his description back to his mother and others of a two-masted sailing ship in a rotting state, sheathed with metal on the bottom, and of an unknown to him type of really strong wood. Thus the story of the schooner the Dismal Swamp. The story was later brought forward in the book Tales of Old Carolina by F. Roy Johnson of Murfreesboro, where he attributes the statement to a Mr. Rice of the Acorn Hill community in Gates County. Perhaps you're familiar with the schooner story or have just heard about it over the years. In any case, it's really important that you keep the story in mind, as it is the very basis of this book. Looking at a county map, you'll note that the Acorn Hill intersection consists of the crossing of Highway 158 and Folly Road, just east of Sunbury, North Carolina. If you're traveling towards the east, it's the last intersection before you pass into the Great Dismal Swamp. But first, you'll notice that you dip down, and then suddenly the Highway 158 East climbs again before you enter the swamp proper. By following this route, you have just crossed the channel of the headwaters of Bennett's Creek, climbed up the Suffolk Scarp, and then plunged 50 feet or so to follow the highway across the swamp towards Elizabeth City. On your approach to the swamp, you'll cross several small bridges, and you might notice that you're only crossing what appears to be a swampy bottom. Not much water to think of floating a schooner along. Well, according to the historic record, this has been a small stream since it was first noted in history by the building of several grist mills across its route. One such mill along this creek is known today as Merchant's Mill Pond. Prior to Merchant's Mill Pond, Hunter's Mill Pond was built at the headwaters of Bennett's Creek in the early 1700s. This mill pond was destroyed by highway construction in 1922. So with these facts in mind, we have to realize that the schooner the Dismal Swamp apparently arrived before these dates, prior to the early 1700s. Now, a little closer to the wreck, we find the remnants of Riddick's Mill, also known as Acorn Hill Mill Pond, or Jones Pond. This mill is dated back to about 1809. Now, once again, we must assume that the schooner arrived prior to the earliest date of record. Today, under normal conditions, the stream is very shallow, and during times of drought, it's merely a quagmire of mud and cypress knees. It has been suggested that perhaps the schooner is actually a canal boat of some type, maybe a periauger or a Dismal Swamp gondola, as named by author Bill Trout and described in his book, The Great Dismal Atlas. I had time to sit down to dinner with Bill Trout at Nixon's restaurant in Edenton. According to Bill, swamp boats and canal boats were not sheathed, as they were not subject to the miseries suffered by seagoing craft. As we consider the above observations, we find that we have a craft that is made of non-native wood and was apparently built to make way in the ocean. The observed remains of the schooner are a good 10 miles, as a crow flies, from navigable water, and about 70 miles from the nearest ocean. How this ship arrived at its swampy graveyard and the calamities she faced are the basis of this story. Let's start way back in time and see if we can put reason and logic to the ship's location and what has been observed. In the latter half of the 1500s, 1550 to 1600, it was a matter of pride and commerce for a gentleman of England to own ships, not just to transport his family and friends from place to place, but to carry on commerce on a large scale, plus the ability to act as a privateer with a license from the Queen to raid any ship not bearing an English flag, especially the Spanish ships, as Spain already had a tight hold on South America and Mexico, known then as New Spain. The Spanish ships would ride the Gulf Stream on an annual basis, hauling away tons of gold and silver for the king's treasury in Spain. Many of these ships were captured and plundered by the English, and many were lost in hurricanes and other Atlantic storms. It is recorded in history that 40 tons of gold was removed annually from South America and Mexico for nearly 50 years. Owning a ship or ships, or even being a partner in a ship, was usually a lucrative venture. However, there's always the other side of the coin. If you could capture and plunder another ship, then you too stood a chance of being captured and plundered. But you would have a slight advantage if you have the element of surprise on your side, and the ability to hide in the meantime. If your ships could be hidden behind a barrier island, like on the coast of North Carolina, and you had a lookout that could spot the approaching flotilla, you could sail out of the inlet and surprise your targets. And the favorite target would be Spanish ships, usually with gold and silver on board, headed for Spain up the Gulf Stream. You could also use your ship to discover new lands and claim them in the name of the Queen or King which you were subject. Then for a share, you could discover the great riches of the new land and be under the protection of the Queen or King of your native country. Untold worth would be at your fingertips. Everybody wins except for the natives of the newly claimed land and the captain and crews of the ships that were plundered at your command. By owning a ship, you presented untold power. By having access to a ship, you had the ability to move about for great distances. As far as the oceans and rivers would take you, anywhere the wind would fill your sails, you could move about. In the early years of exploration, the whole intent, as I see it, was to pursue riches first, like gold, silver, or some type of commodity that other people really wanted. By bringing in the commodity or setting a real good plan to exploit something of value would give you the ability to build more ships and increase your range and pursuit of more riches. No longer would you have to be satisfied with raiding your neighbors, taking their land for your own. Hundreds of years and even thousands of years ago, countries overran each other numerous times. Same land, only under new leadership and ownership. Up until the Spanish explored the gold-rich South American continents, the riches in Europe and Asia never changed, only the owners. After Spain began its exploration of South America like a pack of wolves, the English and French smelled the fresh blood of the Americas and came running. As you can see, only countries that possessed sea power were successful in their endeavors. Spain, inspired by Columbus; England, apparently inspired by the gold that Spain was taking away; and France, wishing for territory, gold, or anything else they could get. Seems by the historic record that all of these maneuvers were then justified as spreading the word of God to the heathens. The Spanish had a unique way of having their cake and eating it too in this matter. After capturing the king, for example, they informed him that he was to accept their Spanish religion, that he would be saved from burning at the stake if he did so. Naturally, the fellow accepted their offer. Then they told him the rest of the story. Since burning at the stake was reserved for non-believers, he instead would only be strangled to death, which they proceeded to do. In reality, setting up a base, colony, or outpost was really a beginning for the search for gold, silver, and a water passage across the continents. Of course, as many natives as possible were converted to Christianity in the process. From an English standpoint, it was mandated by Queen Elizabeth I that any land not already occupied by a Christian prince should be claimed in the name of England. Just prior to 1584, Florida was already under control of Spain. Also, there was a Jesuit outpost on Chesapeake Bay. The Jesuit outpost had a short life, as its occupants were massacred by the local natives there. The English, ignoring these facts, claimed this newly explored portion of North America in the name of the Queen and named it in her honor Virginia. About the same time, France had an outpost in the vicinity of Charleston, South Carolina. The Spanish took this outpost from the French and set up their own occupants while maintaining the Spanish presence in St. Petersburg, Florida, which the English, under Sir Francis Drake, raided almost to total destruction in 1586, and hauling away the slaves for themselves and even the doorknobs from the buildings. It really made no difference if you were a Christian or a native heathen. If you got in the way, you were removed. If you were native, you were converted to Christianity, then enslaved or driven out or murdered. If you were English, you were discovering ways to intercept the gold and silver hauled away by the Spanish. If you were Spanish, you were set on conquest of the whole of South and North America, all in the name of gold, not in the name of Jesus. Ocean-going ships made all of this possible, and made many a seafarer and seafaring nation rich in the process. I guess you can tell now that the schooner of the Dismal Swamp, in my opinion, played an important role. As there is reason for everything, there are specific reasons why the schooner of the Dismal Swamp is where it is and why it got there. Colonization of the New World from an English standpoint began with Sir Humphrey Gilbert, when he was issued a patent by Queen Elizabeth to discover and colonize the North American continent in 1578. Gilbert unfortunately lost his life during a voyage from Newfoundland when his ship, the Squirrel, apparently sank during a storm in 1583. Walter Raleigh, who was yet to be a knight, and Gilbert were half-brothers, and apparently shared a desire for exploration and the wealth that it could bring. Raleigh applied and was granted a patent for exploration and settlement March 25, 1584. This patent carried a term of 6 years. On April 27, 1584, 2 ships, described as 2 barks, departed from Plymouth, England, at Raleigh's expense, to explore and discover such places that a colony could be landed with a good port. Though Raleigh remained in England and never set foot in North America, 2 responsible ships' captains were selected to command the 2 barks. Now, to give you an idea and a vision of what a bark looks like, consider the Elizabeth II, a reproduction on display at Manteo, North Carolina. It is suggested by historian David Beers Quinn in his 2-volume set, The Roanoke Voyages, that the 2 ships were the bark Raleigh of 200 tons and the Dorothie of 50 tons. This is entirely logical, being that both of these ships were owned by Raleigh. It would be an excellent idea if you would keep that in mind as we venture deeper into this story. The 2 ships arrived on the Outer Banks, July 13, 1584, commanded by Captains Master Philip Amatus and Master Arthur Barlow, taking about 6 weeks to make the journey from England. It's indicated in Barlow's narrative the ships anchored just offshore near an inlet that would later be named for a recurrent player, Simon Fernando. At no time is it indicated that the 2 ships penetrated the inlet. However, many passages of the ship's boats are indicated. This for good reason. If one or both of the ships were to run aground and be stuck fast in the inlet, there would be more problems than could be dealt with, not to mention the loss of exploration time that would be vital to the mission and report to Raleigh. Amadas and Barlow being the principal narrator in their reports, first view of Roanoke Island took place at this time. After contact with the Native Americans and enjoying their Indian hospitality, Amadas and Barlow explored the immediate area and through sign language noted names and locations of villages. It appears that their main conversations were with Mateo and Wanchese. These two Native Americans returned to England at the conclusion of the 1584 exploration. After a glowing report from Amadas and Barlow, now Sir Walter Raleigh, who was knighted on January the 6th, 1585, Raleigh sets up his next move to colonize North America. However, I hope that you will retain for future use that the Amadas and Barlow expedition was merely a probe into the New World, to see what was here, and to see if it would sustain a colony and, between the lines, a base of operation for privateering. Raleigh must have been elated. There were but few inlets through the Outer Banks. By setting up guard positions at each of these inlets, no other ships could enter his private sea behind the banks. It was a pirate's, or better known as a privateer's, dream come true. No one could follow you home without being attacked from 3 different positions, each side of the inlet, and a warship waiting in the mouth. If by sheer force you did get in, then you could be easily trapped, as the inlet could be secured behind you. However, there was a problem with the whole scenario, one of depth. Amadas and Barlow offered up that glowing observation of friendly natives and beautiful country, but nowhere in their narrative did they indicate that the inlets and the sounds behind the Outer Banks were too shallow. Remember the barks. Raleigh and Dorothie were anchored outside the inlet, and exploration was accomplished using the ship's boats. So I guess, reading between the lines again, there must have been some doubt as to whether either ship could maneuver through the inlet. In other words, if they truly had felt confident and safe doing so, then they would have done it. During early exploration and colonization, one thing for us to keep in mind was what was released to the general public of England. The better parts were pointed out, and the remaining deterrent parts were suppressed. If the absolute truth be known, then only the hardiest explorers and adventurers would have considered themselves to be colonists. The general public would have scoffed at the idea. If today you were offered a trip to the moon with a written guarantee of safe return when you desired, then I feel that we would have many takers. But in reality, a trip to the moon has many possible pitfalls. Just consider Apollo 13. We came very close to marooning 3 men in space. In 1585, the mindset was very similar to space exploration. Really just too darn scary to consider for most people. To get colonists lined up, there were many promises made or implied by the organizers. 500 acres of land for every man, woman, and child, and a beautiful countryside. The land of milk and honey, where the natives were always friendly and the weather beautiful. Up next, Ralph Lane and company, about 100 men, mostly soldiers, were dropped off at Roanoke Island in the summer of 1585 by Sir Richard Grenville's fleet. This event is historically noted as the first colony, but you may be able to detect this was really a military force put in place to establish a clandestine base, being that the colonists were all men and mostly soldiers. According to Lane's narrative, they were left with one pinnace, similar to a schooner, at least one light horseman, that's a large rowboat, and at least one double wherry, that's another large rowboat with 4 oars. The pinnace and the 2 boats were left for exploration and map-making of the area. One of Lane's first commands sent a detachment of men north through today's Currituck Sound to stay there through the winter and return in the early spring with a report. Now, during this process, it was learned that Currituck Sound would be too treacherous for ship navigation. The same was discovered about today's Pamlico Sound. However, Lane notes in his narratives that today's Albemarle Sound was good for shipping in the channel, but full of shoals, outside the channel. This fact gives us our first clue as to how the schooner of the Dismal Swamp made its way to Gates County. In the fall of 1585, Ralph Lane's company is at Roanoke Island in the fort that his company has built shortly after their arrival a few months prior. There are about 100 men, and mostly soldiers in this first colony. Their published intent is to establish the first English colony under the sponsorship of Sir Walter Raleigh on this continent. Their unpublished intent is to establish a military base, explore the land for the riches like gold and silver, which they assume must be here due to the success of the Spanish in today's South America and Mexico. They would be ready to take it by force from the natives if necessary. Now, among Lane's colonists are two men who have gone down in history as talented and genius: John White, whom we'll hear more about later, and Thomas Harriot, probably one of the greatest mathematicians and navigators of all time. Harriot was to the 16th century what Einstein was to us in the 20th century. Obviously, by looking at the results that Harriot produced during his visit, he was a man of wonder. Basically, he was responsible for producing the first maps of Virginia, as it was called, using simple tools and his mathematical theories. Plus, there was John White, a great artist, to translate Harriot's work. Now, he is responsible for producing the map 1585 Virginia Pars. I know for years you've seen the woodcut reproductions credited to DeBry. These woodcuts are based loosely on Harriot's observation and John White's artwork. According to the historical record, Thomas Harriot made cartographic observations, and John White then interpreted these observations to paper. If today you compare the 1585 Virginia Pars with a satellite photo of the Outer Banks area, you'll know that they are nearly identical. For the purpose of this audio book, we'll be using the 1585 Virginia Pars as the only map that will give us clues for solving the mystery of the schooner of the Dismal Swamp. Reason being, every other English map was based on this map. I guess you're saying to yourself by now, this is really getting to be deep stuff. Kings and queens in other countries, long ago and far away, artists, gentlemen, geniuses, secret maps, secret Navy bases, pirates, Native Americans. Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, then just hang on, because the whole ride is just going to get a little tougher. The schooner story is only a minute part of one of the most complex mysteries ever thrown on mankind. And here it lives in northeastern North Carolina, right in our own backyard, right under our noses. Some of the more interesting observations and actions of Ralph Lane, noted in his narratives, are trips that he personally made up the Chowan River. First, as mentioned earlier, he explored the Albemarle Sound and noted it was good for shipping. He flat out says that Currituck Sound to the north of Roanoke Island is dangerous, as well as Pamlico Sound due to the shallowness of the waters. Ralph Lane notes in his narratives the high cliffs on the western side of the Chowan River, bordering Bertie and Hertford counties in North Carolina. He notes the names of the Indian villages on the north shore of the Albemarle Sound, especially at Edenton. Then he reveals the names of the Indian villages along the Chowan from the mouth to Coleraine to Harrisville. March 26, 1586, Ralph Lane goes ashore at today's Swain's Mill and walks boldly into Choanoke, the largest village on the river, spread out from Swain's Mill Inlet almost to the mouth of the Wickacon on the high bluffs. When Lane arrives, he discovers there are several tribes represented in discussion about doing away with the whites that have come ashore at Roanoke Island. Learning this, so he indicated, he immediately seized the king named Monadnock and his son SKYE, put them in restraints, and held one against the other for information about the area. Lane was there at Harrisville, Swain's Mill, the village of Choanoke, for 2 days, questioning Monadnock about the country. Later, in his narrative, he indicates that he learned more about the country and its inhabitants in those 2 days than he had learned in the 6 months prior to his stop at Choanoke. Now, from Ralph Lane's narrative, from the stop near Harrisville, Roanoke, we pick up another clue for the schooner. Under questioning, Monadnock reveals to Lane that 3 days up his river, the Chowan River, and descending to the land and following a trail for 4 days, you would come out on a bay to the northeast that contained an island surrounded by deep water. The king of that island, or province, as Lane indicated, had many pearls. At this point in the narrative, Lane describes how he would travel up the river with guides promised by Monadnock and penetrate the trail and make his way cross-country. However, Lane felt that he did not have enough men or resources at the time to get underway immediately. You can see in his narrative the excitement due to the mention of pearls. At this point, Lane is also told of strange things up the Roanoke River, like possibly a passage to the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean, gold and silver. As a result of this encounter near Harrisville, Lane immediately, according to his narrative, sent SKYE into the Penobscot and on to Roanoke Island. With a group of men in 2 smaller boats, a wherry and a light horseman, he set out for the Roanoke River. Now it's as if Monadnock has pushed a hot button on Lane that set him off. By all indications, the 2 days of conversation gave Monadnock the key to Lane's mind. He finally discovered what the white man was after: riches and a way to the Pacific through the continent. Please note that Monadnock directed Lane to the Roanoke River, not the Chowan. Plus, Monadnock had previously directed Lane to the Chesapeake Bay, or what might be known today as the James River. Like a bird trying to protect his nest from a predator, Monadnock said everything he could to direct Lane away from his territory. The Native Americans were great observers of nature for thousands of years, and many times used, as you will see, natural practices of the creatures to control the white man. Monadnock knew that Lane would choose riches over the Chowan. By Lane making such a decision, he unknowingly stepped into a trap, one that was designed to end his life and the life of his crew. By sending Lane into the Roanoke River in search of phantom gold, Monadnock has seen a way to rid himself of a menace, because he knows that Lane will probably be killed by a tribe of Roanoke River Indians that call themselves Mangoke. The Algonquin Indians, locally known as Roanoke, are less warlike. They're more hunter-gatherers and fishers than the Mangokes. The Mangokes are fierce in dealing with strangers or enemies getting into their territory. Very seldom was there a compromise created, even between them and their neighbors. Monadnock knew this from experience. It made no difference who you were, Indian or white. If you entered their territory, the Roanoke River, you may as well plan on being attacked for your own stupidity. This is exactly what happened. 4 days up the Roanoke River, Ralph Lane's 2 crewed boats consisting of 40 men encountered the Mangoke, lining the shoreline. To paraphrase Lane, they were singing and whooping, sending out a greeting as we approached. Matteo, who was with Lane, realizing that Lane had no idea what was about to happen, told Lane, "They're not greeting you, but intend to fight with you." Almost immediately, that warning was followed by a hail of arrows launched by the Mangokes. Lane and his crew returned fire, but the Mangokes retreated up the embankments to the woods. Lane notes that no one is injured in the attack. At this point, with the help of his crew, Lane takes a consensus among his men whether to continue or to turn around. They decide to go 1 more day, then turn around and come down the Roanoke River in 1 day. Coming down the Roanoke River in 1 day with the current after having rowed against that current for 4 days gives us some idea how swiftly the current was running back in that day. Today, due to the damming upstream in the Roanoke Rapids area, the Roanoke flows more gently. Now, when Lane and company descended the Roanoke, they stopped at an island. Quinn thinks that the island is the Sans Souci Island before entering the Albemarle Sound. As indicated in his narrative, they have eaten 2 dogs that they carried with them on the trip, but were nearly starving when they arrived at the island in the mouth of the Roanoke. The next day, after eating sassafras leaves that were boiled, they were forced to linger one more day due to the Albemarle Sound being so rough. Lane says that he was afraid that they would lose their boats. Next day, the weather cleared, and the two boats made their way across the Sound to the Edenton area. There they found the natives gone, but did get a few fish from the fish traps. Arriving the next day back at Roanoke Island, the natives were quite upset because they thought that they were looking at ghosts or immortals. The point being, according to Lane, they all should have died at the hands of the Mangokes, but all men survived, and no one was injured. Somehow, they had slipped through Manatodon's trap. Soon after the trip up the Roanoke River, Lane indicates that all good relations with the natives were coming to an end due to aggressiveness and heavy-handed action on the colonists' part. The white man was feared by the natives due to the thoughts that dead men, ghosts, could do them more harm than live ones. Lane indicates their thinking being centered around the thought that even if they were killed, Lane and company, they only stayed dead for a short period of time and would come back to life and play havoc with their native lives. Up until Lane and company's arrival at Roanoke Island, relations with the natives were in good standing, just as Amadas and Barlow had left it in 1584. Lane, being a military man, handled relations so differently by demanding food immediately and demanding provisions be made for their future needs as well. Taking SKYE as hostage and putting Manatodon in handcuffs for 2 days certainly did not help the situation either. SKYE, as you might remember, had already been taken to Roanoke Island in the Penobscot, where he was being questioned. Lane also indicated to him that if he tried to escape, he would have his head cut off. You can just imagine how Manatodon felt about this. His most loved son's life was riding on his every move. If he began to retaliate for the kidnapping, his son most likely would suffer death at the hands of Lane's forces. Instead, Manatodon sent a message from Choanoke near Harrisville to Roanoke Island. He sent Lane a present of pearls, which Lane found out was actually a ransom for his son, Manatodon's son's release. When Lane found out that the pearls were a ransom and not just a gift, he refused them and kept SKYE locked away. Manatodon also sent the messenger to tell Lane that he had commanded the king of the Wampanoag at Edenton to pledge allegiance to Queen Elizabeth and to Sir Walter Raleigh. This action makes Manatodon's position clear. He is the king of the Chowan River, and the other kings of the other local tribes bowed to Manatodon's commands. Lane is visited at Roanoke Island by the Wampanoag king Okisco, where with 24 of his higher men he tells Lane that the deed is done. He and his tribe are now subject to the queen and to Raleigh. They go about putting out fish traps and planting corn for the English force. Lane indicates in his narrative that he is very happy about this. As soon as the corn is ready to harvest in about 2 months, in the month of July, the English will be established with a good store of food and a bright future. What Lane has not learned yet is the natives have twice used what the natives have learned. You need to tell the white man what he wants to hear to relieve the force against them. Lane, thinking the English were superior in all things to the natives, failed to notice that the English were only superior in arms. In no way were the Chowanokes and the other tribes short on wisdom. By Lane demanding food on a regular basis, the natives discovered the English weakness. The English could not be independent because of the food shortage and continually penetrated Indian villages looking for it. While all of this maneuvering has been going on by Lane, Thomas Harriot and John White are continuing to map the area and making other observations. They're using a tilt boat, which is described as a ship's boat, either a wherry or a light horseman, with an awning to protect them from the burning sun. Harriot will go on to write his book about all the things that he's seen and how different plants and animals and other resources are used and can be used by future settlers. Harriot's book by itself is quite fascinating and entitled A Brief and True Report. However, Harriot's book is not published until 1588. John White's artwork, too, is not published until the same year, along with DeBry's woodcut maps based on John White's artwork. We are all familiar with White's drawings, as they have been used over and over again to this very day, as how life appeared at first contact between Englishmen and Native Americans. In northeastern North Carolina, this should be of special interest to us, as some of the observations were made along the shore of the Albemarle Sound, the Roanoke, and the Chowan Rivers. Well, back at Roanoke Island, Ralph Lane continues to question SKYE, that's Monadnon's son. SKYE apparently, according to Quinn, is allowed to visit within the camp of the Roanoke Indians. In other words, in his military way, Ralph Lane is using SKYE as a spy to gather information and report back to him as to what the natives are feeling about the English force. The Roanoke chief takes SKYE into his confidence and reveals to him a plot to bring in men from all the tribes in the area to destroy Lane's colony. The Roanoke king offers copper as payment to the tribes to help in the total destruction. The Mangokes readily agree. However, Akisko, head of the Wep-Emiok near present-day Edenton, refuses to participate in the murderous plans and returns home. You can only imagine that Akisko, who was subject to Monadnon and being under Monadnon's control, and SKYE being Ralph Lane's prisoner, would mean death to Akisko if the plot was discovered and SKYE was killed or harmed as a result. Plus, there seems to be a mutual respect going on between Monadnon and Ralph Lane. Monadnon by his actions and Lane by his words. Of course, Monadnon is under continuous threat with his son's life on the line. However, this does show the wisdom of Monadnon. He knows that he is at the disadvantage and will do nothing against the colonists to further upset the situation. He, too, must be fearful, knowing that the Roanokes and the Mangokes are about to attack Lane and his men. According to historic record, one Roanoke tribesman is killed for revealing the Roanoke king's plans to Lane. Perhaps this tribesman is trying to sell information to Lane, or is accused purposely by Lane and his men as a diversion to take the suspicion off SKYE as the informant. It does not seem logical that Lane would tell the Roanoke king that he had been given an awareness of the Roanoke's plans, or that the tribesmen would tell others in the tribe that he had done so. Surely the natives understood that to reveal such a plan to Lane and being caught would be instant death. To still further put SKYE above suspicion, Lane puts SKYE in irons and threatens to kill him if he tries to escape again. Apparently, Lane has told the Roanoke king that SKYE had tried to escape and he was going to kill him for trying. Lane is then conveniently talked out of that plan by the Roanoke king himself. Considering Lane's military ways, I do not think that Lane would have hesitated to kill SKYE, let alone tell the Roanoke king that he really meant to do so. About the same time, Lane does another diversion, but this time admits to it in his narrative. Lane sends a message to the Roanoke king that he has word that his Lane's fleet is about to arrive to pick them up and wants to hire men to hunt and fish for them. He indicates that he wants to buy provisions to cover his travel to meet the fleet at Croatoan. By exhibiting this diversion, Lane gets the Roanoke king to believe that the attack on Lane's colony is not going to be necessary. According to Lane, the Roanoke king is so accommodating that he will attend to matters himself. The Roanoke king is exhibiting much enthusiasm, kind of like in modern times having a much despised neighbor tell you that he's moving away. You gladly help him pack the moving van. Lane's diversion works because there is no attack on his colony. Also, there is nothing about supplies from the Roanoke king either. The Roanoke king indicated to Lane that he would be over soon and would bring some Wep-Emioks and Mangokes. However, he keeps putting this event off. While Lane begins to worry about the potential of hostile tribesmen coming to Roanoke Island more than he can handle, Lane decides to attack first. During this time period, the Roanoke king is in his main village in the vicinity of today's Mans Harbor, within earshot and sight of Roanoke Island. Just a short canoe trip and you're there. Lane decides first to kill the Roanoke tribesmen on Roanoke Island, now gathering there. He indicates, in not so many words, to do so at night and in a very stealthy manner. They intend to gather up and destroy all the canoes on Roanoke Island, so the Roanoke king cannot be warned of the coming attack from the English. Lane wants to attack before the Roanoke king can gather a large force. While gathering and disabling the canoes, Lane's men spots one canoe with 2 natives on board rowing away from Roanoke Island, headed for Man's Harbor. They quickly and silently as possible overthrow the canoe and cut off the heads of the unfortunate canoeists. They're using swords apparently, and not guns, as the Roanoke group at Man's Harbor would have heard the shots and be warned that action was taking place. But the canoe incident is observed by the Roanoke tribesmen there on Roanoke Island. Lane says that the Roanokes kept a constant watch on the Englishmen day and night, as the English did on the natives. Immediately, the Roanokes take to their bows and arrows, and Lane's men to their guns. Shooting starts. Lane's men shoot 3 or 4, with the remaining tribesmen taking to the woods. Apparently, none of Lane's men are seriously injured. Conjecturing now, Lane has to explain away the shots fired, which could have been easily heard across the narrow Roanoke Sound. Lane has to formulate, or has already created, a reason so that he can get close enough to attack the remaining tribesmen and the king of the Roanokes at Man's Harbor. The next morning, Lane and 27 of his men leave Roanoke Island for Man's Harbor. When they arrive, they're met by one of the Roanoke king's men. Lane sends word to the Roanoke king that he wants to complain about one of the Roanoke men who have tried to set SKYE free the night before. Conjecturing this will explain the gunfire from the night before. Apparently believing Lane's story, the Roanoke king allowed Lane and his men to come into their camp, where, at a given phrase, Lane's men attack the king and his men. The king falls, plays dead, then gets up and runs into the woods, followed by 2 of Lane's men. Lane reports that he meets these 2 men returning from the woods with the severed head of the Roanoke king. To say the least, Lane has now completely ruined future relations with many of the tribes of the area. However, hope of a decent relationship with the Croatoans remains high, as Medio remains loyal to the English. None of Lane's, or you might say Raleigh's, objectives have been met. No gold, no harbor, no way to the South Sea, no secret base. However, you must admire Lane as a leader. Not one of his men, about 100, was killed or injured during the stay at Roanoke Island, which also proves that this was a military operation. Each man knew how to defend themselves and continuously worked as a team. In later colonies, there are many notations of sluggards and those just too dainty to work. For us in northeastern North Carolina, Lane has introduced himself directly with his notations of the high banks of the Chowan River, his description of the Chowan being tideless and only driven by the wind. He tells of entering the villages of Chonoke between Haresville and Swain's Mill. He introduces us to Monadnock, possibly the most powerful chief south of Powhatan and his confederacy in today's Commonwealth of Virginia. His kingdoms stretch for nearly 50 miles, from the confluence of the Blackwater and the Nottoway rivers to the Albemarle Sound. Monadnock's villages line the shores of the Chowan at Parker's Ferry, Haresville, Coleraine, Edenton, and was capable of putting 700 fighting men in the field at one time. Not one member of the Chonoke tribe exists today, according to anthropologists, as they left the area after contact or were greatly reduced by disease, assimilated by the Meherrin and the white men, and finally the last few confined to a small reservation on Catherine's Creek in Gates County, which they traded away for a pair of white horses. A few days after Lane and his raiding party killed the Roanoke king, Sir Francis Drake, with his fleet of 23 ships, appeared off the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Drake sent word to Lane that he would resupply his force with food, appanates, and boats if he desired, or he would pick him and his men up and return them to England. Lane first off elected to be resupplied. Drake assigned him the ship Francis, along with sailors to handle it. Lane's provisions were moved into the Francis, along with some of Lane's officers and some of his men. When the Francis was loaded and ready for Lane to continue his explorations, a severe storm, possibly a hurricane, started to blow. The storm was so strong and such a threat that the Francis, having lost its cables and anchors, and the rest of the fleet put to sea to keep from being wrecked on the shoals. 4 days later, Drake returned, told Lane that the Francis was not coming back. Drake offered another ship for the mission. This time Lane refused the offer and took a vote among his remaining men. They all elected to be taken off of Roanoke Island and returned to England, thus ending the colony of 1585. There's a very interesting notation by Drake in his official log. 3 men were dispatched during the storm. There's no indication that the men were dispatched in a boat, but to travel anywhere in the region, some type of watercraft was needed. It is presumed by Quinn that the 3 men were returning SKYE to his home near Harrisville at Roanoke. I remember the first time I heard this story of the 3 men left stranded, told to me by the late Percy Minton of a Husky at a Pancake Rotary Day. He had me fascinated. How did he know that? He told me how to find out. Just look, he said. I've been looking ever since and found it in Drake's log. The 3 men were never seen again by white men as Drake departed with Lane and his company. However, this thought does work logically, as throughout Lane's narrative he speaks highly of SKYE and Monadnock. At times he uses SKYE as a savage boy that keeps trying to escape, but for some reason he never does, even when he's spending time with the Roanoke King completely out of sight of Lane and his men. I feel that safe transport back home to Roanoke was Lane's way of saying thank you for a job well done. SKYE was a most excellent spy for Lane and an honor to his father. Without SKYE, Lane's colony on more than one occasion could have been slaughtered. Lane could have easily killed SKYE at any time and broken Monadnock's heart in the process.